things have slowed a bit, so I think we're probably ready to get started. Thank you all so much for joining us for this media briefing on the upcoming federal emissions reductions plan. I'm Vicky, I'm the communications lead at Climate Action Network Réseau Climat Canada. And before we dive in, I'm just going to quickly go over some housekeeping details. So this is a bilingual briefing. We will have panelists speaking in English and in French. And to access the simultaneous translation, you can just click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen and select your preferred language. Alors, comme cette point de presse est bilingue et les panélistes vont s'exprimer en français et en anglais, vous pouvez accéder à la traduction simultanée par cliquer sur le bouton interprétation en bas de l'écran et sélectionner la langue de votre choix. So we're going to have 4 panelists speaking today. We'll have our National Policy Manager, Caroline Brouillette. We'll have Julia Croome, who's a lawyer at Ecojustice. Émile Boisseau-Bouvier, who's Climate Policy and Ecological Transition Analyst at Équiterre, as well as Ken Bondy, who's the National Representative for Health, Safety and Environment at Unifor. And after that, we will have a period for questions. So if you've got questions, and we hope that you will, please leave them until the end. We'll be taking questions after everyone's had a chance to give their initial thoughts on the plan and what to expect. So with that, I will turn it over to Caro to give us a quick overview of her high-level thoughts on the plan.
Thanks so much, Vicky, et merci à tout le monde d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. I'm joining from unceded Ganyan-Gehaga territory in what is colonially known as Montreal. So let me first start by describing the moment that we are in right now at the convergence of multiple and devastating crises. We have just reached 2 years of a global pandemic that has disproportionately affected marginalized communities and Canada and the world, and that unfortunately is still not over. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has resulted in a war with horrifying humanitarian consequences, putting global security and cooperation at risk and destabilizing food and very volatile fossil-fueled energy systems. And we are getting continuously, dangerously closer to catastrophic climate change. The latest IPCC report on adaptation and impacts was described as an atlas of human suffering. And these impacts are not just happening on paper, they are happening here and now, as British Columbians, for instance, painfully experienced last year. So this emissions reduction plan that the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act requires Minister Guilbeault to table by the end of the month has the potential to be a game-changing document at this important moment. It will be the first plan tabled under this new act, the country's first ever comprehensive climate accountability framework. This act, as a reminder, was adopted last summer after years of civil society organizing and asking for Canada to adopt a governance framework to respond to its continued missing of its own climate targets. And as we manage to bend now for COVID-19 case curves, Canada has still not managed to bend the curve of its greenhouse gas emissions. Previous climate plans have failed to provide the clear and accessible information that is required to assess the effectiveness of climate policy. These plans haven't shown the public how the government is supporting a just transition away from a fossil-based economy and how it will better the lives of Canadians at a time when we're facing the incredible strain of these overlapping crises. So this first plan tabled under the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act has the potential to close the gap between Canada's currently inadequate contribution to the global effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Paris Agreement signatories have committed to doing just that in Glasgow, and that means that Canada needs to enhance its ambition and action to put it in line with its fair share of the global effort to limit warming to that crucial temperature threshold. This week's supply and confidence agreement between the Liberals and NDP provides stability and certainty regarding climate policy, not only for policymakers, but also for investors, workers, and consumers across the country, and this until 2025. This means more political space and crucial time to implement the plan and the policies that it will outline. Rather than be a cause for slowing down, this context must be leveraged to increase the speed and scale of the government's climate action so that it meets the urgency of the moment. As I said earlier, Canada has never reached any of its own climate targets. This plan is an opportunity to correct that, but for this, it must be ambitious, inclusive, transparent, and should put forward this whole of government approach we saw outlined in mandate letters in more details. My fellow panelists will share some specifics on these elements and how we collectively hope the government will seize this crucial opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caro. Next up, we're going to hear from Julia. Over to you, Julia.
Thanks, Caro. Thanks, Vicky. I will try to share my screen. Bear with me. It's not a precondition for being a lawyer to have any technical skills. So I'm going to be looking to the side here as I've got my screen switched, but that should show up there. Okay.
Yeah, it's working for us. Thanks.
Thank you. So as Caro mentioned, we're facing a sort of unprecedented an ambitious moment in the Canadian climate change battle. We've heard the federal government declare over the last 7 years that Canada would remake itself as a leader in the fight against climate change. And while some important actions like carbon pricing have obviously been implemented, we've barely seen that rate of increase tip. Now, the last plan we saw from the federal government, the Strengthened Climate Plan in December of 2020, was the first modeled plan to reach a target, and that target was the old target, 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. This state of affairs does not meet the moment, but something has changed, which is in the last year, we have the passage of the Net Zero Emissions and Accountability Act, which I'll call the Act, passed in June of 2021. What does that act do? Really, there are two key elements. First, to set national emissions reductions targets on an ambitious path to net zero emissions by 2050. So these targets are set out, prescribed in the Act for 2030, 2035, 2040, and 2045. The government has announced that the new 2030 target is a 40 to 45% range reduction from 2005 levels by 2030. The second element or purpose of the Act is to require the government to set about meeting those regular targets with immediate ambition, transparency, and accountability. What does that mean, and how does the Act do that? Well, it sets up this rather detailed and frankly quite onerous schedule of deliverables, requirements on the federal government over the rest of this key decade. The emissions reduction plan, which is due next week, which is to chart our pathway to the 2030 target, progress reports, expert advisory reports, reports by the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development. On top of that, we've heard from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices that it will fill a reporting gap in this schedule and provide its own assessments of both the ERP and progress. The idea of all of this is borne out, and the idea was the example we've seen borne out in countries like the UK, that this schedule and the requirements under this schedule will sort of inexorably push the government, push climate policy where it needs to go. So there are all those elements, those deliverables under the Act, and the Act itself also fleshes out what each of those has to do. The ERP itself under the Act has a number of requirements. So it's not just you must deliver a plan to reach your 2030 target. You must deliver a plan and it must contain, and then a laundry list of requirements, including the fact that they must describe the emissions reductions measures that they intend to take to achieve the target, describe international commitments, set out sectoral strategies, and set out a timetable for implementation. There's others as well, but I just want to give you a bit of a high-level capture of the fact that there are pretty detailed requirements for the contents of the ERP. The ERP doesn't operate, though, as a standalone. It's very much really all the components of those deliverables under the Act are interlinked. But in particular, the ERP is inexorably linked to the progress reports. The first progress report will be issued no later than the end of 2023. And then there will be further progress reports this decade in 2025 and 2027. They have to show where we are on the path to the 2030 target. And that pathway is defined by the ERP. So these two elements, the progress reporting and the ERP, clearly have to work together. So if targets are the goals, accountability is the means, and that ties back into that second arm of the purpose of this Act. It sets out to reach those targets by way of being accountable and transparent. But what does it mean to be accountable? Through our work and looking at best practices in international cases and really analyzing the text of the Act, we have a few specific things that we'd be looking for. First of all, to be accountable, and this seems sort of patent, but it's not necessarily always been the case. You have to be able to track the ERP. You have to see, we'd like to see measures and strategies clearly set out in such a way that anyone can pick one out from the plan. And then when that first progress report comes along, as I mentioned, you can look at the first progress report and say, okay, what's the status of this measure from the ERP? Sad to say this has not been the case previously. To give you an idea of what the measures would looked like under the Pan-Canadian framework and the later plan, the Strength and Climate Plan, which is here on the right, you really just see a laundry list of fairly wordy commitments, no timelines, frankly, no numbering. So how do you pick out any one of these elements and say what's happening with it down the road? It's made incredibly difficult, and that in and of itself is a barrier to accountability. We don't want to see that again. Again, arguably kind of obvious, but not present to date in the planning from this government or previous governments on climate, you need to break down these measures and strategies into objectives. They've got their own guidance around this, so I'm taking a page from their own book, but it's a general best practice. You need to be able to break out and pull from the measure specific actions, behaviors, or outcomes that are observable, measurable, and time-bound. These are the three I'll focus on. So going through the Strength and Climate Plan, for example, when you look at some of these measures, a given measure may or may not include the cost or the funding associated with the measure. It may or may not include a timeline. It may or may not include a responsible department. Each of the measures should include every single one of these elements. These things should be clearly set out with respect to every measure and every sectoral strategy in the ERP. Anything less than that just simply cannot deliver on accountability. Who's responsible? When will this start? At what point is it behind schedule? The ERP should be able to answer all of these questions. Another element of planning under the ERP really ties back to data. We know from lots of studies on the Canadian climate policy context that we have significant existing data gaps that make progress reporting difficult or impossible. The ERP obviously can't fill up all those data gaps. and we won't see them filled yet, but there should be a plan to fill them. And the ERP should be set up in such a way that where there are gaps, it speaks to the fact that those gaps exist and starts to set out, again, that plan to fill them. Communication around the complexity of climate change is another element of what we need to see here. This is, again, a well-studied best practice. The ERP can and should be including the use of data indicators. So ideas that communicate the complexity of the measures of the plan. To give you an example, scrolling down here, we know the German International Energy Agency uses ideas like energy consumption and transport, percentage change in urban green space. We need to step outside of the usual bureaucratic notions of what climate measures entail and require, and capture the complexity and the cross-cutting natures of the measures. Those in and of themselves can help identify data gaps, so relating back, and really, again, drive the kind of reporting out and detail that we need to see in order to deliver on accountability. A new element or a new piece of information that we'll see in ERP that we have not seen yet is a 2026 objective. This will be essentially a data point setting out the pathway in the emissions reductions that this government is planning for to reach its 2030 target. So really, we can't say, we don't know what that number will be, what the objective will be. It's not legally binding in the same way that the 2030 target is, but it really does speak to the ambition and the intention of the government in driving that pathway. So we'd be looking for really as much detail, clear measures in how that objective will be met in the ERP. Lastly, and this is another legislative requirement, the climate plan is required to explain in detail how its measures will contribute to Canada achieving net zero by 2050. So while, again, this plan is tied to the 2030 target, the entire structure of the plan, the act is really is aiming towards that distant 2050 point. And this plan does not get a pass on keeping that distant point in mind. We are setting ourselves up to that 2050 target, and we need to be thinking ahead all the time. That's part of why this act is so important, changing our sort of policy horizon from 2, 3, 4 years down to really decades down the road. That's the only way in which effective planning and the type of change we need to see to achieve our climate goals and targets can be achieved. So that it's legislative requirement. The question will be, again, the level of detail, how fulsome the explanation is of how the climate plan will contribute to net zero by 2050. So that's something as well we'll definitely be looking for. And with that, I will pass it over to Émile.
Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Émile Boisseau-Bouvier, je suis analyste des politiques climatiques chez Équiterre et je vis et je travaille à Tiohtià:ke, Montréal. Aujourd'hui, je vais pouvoir vous parler de nos attentes pour 3 secteurs, soit celui du pétrole et du gaz, celui des transports et celui de l'électricité. Le plan de réduction des émissions 2030 qui sera présenté la semaine prochaine, ça devra être ambitieux. On n'est pas du tout sur la bonne trajectoire pour atteindre nos cibles, ça vous le savez déjà, et il va devoir s'assurer que tous les secteurs fassent leur part pour qu'on atteigne nos cibles. Quand je dis ça, je pense évidemment au secteur pétrolier et gazier qui représente 26% du bilan canadien des GES. Je pense aussi au secteur du transport qui en représente 25%. Des secteurs qui ne sont malheureusement pas sur une pente descendante. Le dernier rapport d'Inventaire national du Canada révèle qu'il y a un grave déséquilibre entre les différents secteurs de l'économie canadienne dans l'effort climatique. Entre 1990 et 2019, les données les plus récentes, le secteur de l'électricité a réussi à réduire ses émissions de l'ordre de 36%. Celui de l'industrie lourde a réduit ses émissions de 20%. Pourtant, les émissions du Canada ont augmenté de 21% au cours de la période 1990-2019. Pourquoi? Bien, principalement en raison de la hausse pour le secteur pétrolier et gazier, une hausse de 87%, et une hausse de 54 pour le secteur des transports. Et ça, c'est sans compter l'impact considérable des émissions qui proviennent des combustibles fossiles canadiens qui sont exportés, qui sont brûlés à l'extérieur du pays. Les données d'Environnement Canada montrent qu'en 2019, les émissions liées aux combustibles fossiles canadiens qui sont exportés étaient supérieures aux émissions nationales totales. Donc, nos exportations d'hydrocarbures à l'extérieur de nos frontières dépassaient les émissions à l'intérieur du Canada. Évidemment, lorsqu'un secteur n'assume pas la responsabilité de son impact surdimensionné, la charge se déplace vers les autres secteurs, vers les travailleurs, vers les consommateurs. Avec le plan de réduction des émissions 2030, ça doit changer. Le secteur pétrolier et gazier ne peut pas bénéficier d'un traitement de faveur. Ça va donc être bien important de voir si les réductions d'émissions qui sont prévues pour ce secteur vont être au moins aussi ambitieuses que pour l'ensemble de l'économie. Sinon, le gouvernement va aller à l'encontre de nombreux rapports récents. Par exemple, l'Institut de l'énergie Trottier nous rappelait au début de ce mois-ci que d'un point de vue du système énergétique, une réduction substantielle des émissions du secteur pétrolier et gazier constitue le moyen le plus facile, le moyen le moins cher de réduire les émissions globales. L'Institut proposait d'ailleurs des réductions de l'ordre de 60 d'ici 2030 pour le secteur pétrolier et gazier canadien. Par ailleurs, puisqu'il y a eu un petit peu de confusion récemment à ce sujet, je pense qu'il est pertinent de rappeler que le plan de réduction des émissions 2030, qui va sortir la semaine prochaine, est différent du plan de plafonnement et de réduction des émissions du secteur pétrolier et gazier. Ce dernier devrait sortir vers la fin de 2022 ou le début de 2023. Le ministre Guilbeault a évoqué le besoin de consulter plus en profondeur les différentes parties prenantes afin de déterminer quel mécanisme devra être utilisé pour ce plan de plafonnement et de réduction des émissions du secteur pétrolier et gazier. Donc, le plan présenté la semaine prochaine va avoir des prévisions pour ce secteur, mais celle-ci pourrait très bien changer avec le plan de plafonnement qui sera présenté au tournant 2022-2023. Pour l'instant, j'ai beaucoup parlé du secteur pétrolier et gazier, mais ça va être aussi important d'avoir un œil sur celui du transport qui représente un autre quart des émissions canadiennes. Pour atteindre nos cibles, il va falloir changer notre modèle qui est actuellement basé sur l'auto-solo et il va falloir favoriser les investissements en transport collectif, en transport actif. Pour les véhicules légers, les voitures qu'on connaît, les réductions doivent entre autres passer par une norme VZE, une norme véhicule zéro émission qui est ambitieuse, qui permettrait d'atteindre l'objectif de 100 de vente de véhicules électriques en 2035. Ça va être intéressant aussi de voir la semaine prochaine si les objectifs de vente de véhicules électriques seront rehaussés par rapport à ce qui est déjà prévu. Les détails, par contre, de la norme VZE ne devraient pas être dans ce plan, devraient suivre par la suite. Et puis, pour le transport lourd, on voudrait voir, entre autres, le Canada formaliser son engagement pris à la COP26 d'avoir 100 de nouveaux camions, de nouveaux autobus qui seraient zéro émission d'ici 2040. Pour ça, il faudrait qu'il augmente les incitatifs financiers pour les véhicules mi-lourds, pour les véhicules commerciaux zéro émission. Et puis, sur un autre point, celui de l'électricité, même si ce secteur a réussi à réduire ses émissions dans les dernières années, il va devoir poursuivre ses efforts. Pour le secteur de l'électricité, on s'attend à ce que le gouvernement réitère son engagement en faveur d'un réseau électrique à 90 sans émissions d'ici 2030. Et puis, ça devrait bien sûr inclure une modélisation du retrait de la production d'électricité à partir du charbon. Le gouvernement a aussi comme objectif d'avoir un réseau électrique 100 carboneutre d'ici 2035, mais puisque le document de travail vient tout juste d'être publié, on ne s'attend pas à avoir plus de détails dans le plan de réduction des émissions de la semaine prochaine. On les attend plutôt pour le 2023, ces détails-là. Et puis, dans le contexte économique actuel, ce serait intéressant de voir le plan de la semaine prochaine parler d'abordabilité pour les Canadiens et les Canadiennes, montrer comment les ménages vont pouvoir réduire leurs coûts énergétiques grâce aux engagements qui sont contenus dans ce plan-là. Par exemple, est-ce qu'il va y avoir des mesures de rénovation éco-énergétique, des mesures pour les véhicules électriques, les rendre plus accessibles? Comment est-ce qu'on peut réduire la facture énergétique des Canadiens? Et puis, finalement, avant de passer la parole à Ken, Je tiens à rappeler que le gouvernement va avoir un test de crédibilité climatique immédiatement après le dévoilement du plan de réduction des émissions. En effet, le cabinet va devoir rendre sa décision sur le projet pétrolier Baie du Nord, un projet qui est clairement incompatible avec nos objectifs climatiques. Évidemment, on est bien conscient de l'importance de soutenir les travailleurs, les travailleuses, de soutenir les communautés qui sont encore dépendantes des énergies fossiles. Et c'est là où avoir une stratégie de transition juste prend toute son importance. Il faut planifier la transition dès maintenant si on ne veut pas la subir. Et je vais pouvoir laisser Ken en parler plus amplement.
Yes, thank you. And that's a perfect segue to the points that I wanted to make. So some or most people may be aware that Unifor is the largest private sector union in Canada, representing 315,000 members in all sectors of the Canadian economy. So what you just heard was the statistical percentages of sectors that are impacting the environment. And I would argue that probably every sector of our economy impacts in one way or the other. The important thing is to remember, as we look to reduce our carbon footprint, is that we can't simply reduce workers. Workers matter, and workers deserve to maintain good paying, safe jobs. And as we work towards this carbon reduction, we have to work hard with all of our partners in the economy to ensure that that change is being made without any pain to the Canadian people. So that has to be a partnership with not just labor, but with obviously the politicians, business, and the environmental organizations that are speaking to you here on this meeting day. So when you look at our concern and the percentages of the economy that are developed and impacting on the environment, from our perspective, the worker perspective, we have 45,000 of our members working in the transportation sector. 40,000 of our members work in major auto manufacturing. 12,000 of our members work in the energy and gas sector. And 22,000 people work in the forestry sector, which also has an impact on an opposite end as to how do we manage and grow the forestry that is continually being used to build housing, the housing boom across Canada and so forth. So all of these factors are going to impact the workers working in those sectors as well. So we have to have that discussion. I've often said that if workers are not at the table in any of these discussions, then you're not doing this properly, because you're not going to get the support of the Canadian people. You're not going to get the support of the working Canadians across the country. And we don't need to see radical shifts across the country as people try to chase jobs because we are being successful at our reduction process. Unifor certainly supports, as a socially conscious union, that we need to reduce our carbon footprint. We need to create a better environment for generations to come. But again, it has to be thought out cautiously. And also the other thing that doesn't often get talked about is that we have to look at how do we develop these mechanisms without having a negative impact on our overall trade. What we don't want to see is to have businesses that are currently located in Canada. Many of them, I would again argue the majority of them are invested from outside of Canada. They're not Canadian-owned businesses. And what we have to do carefully is to ensure that we just don't give them an opportunity to leave because they do not agree with what is being implemented in Canadian law. So that bigger discussion has to be done at a roundtable, that we do that properly and significantly. And the final thing I wanted to speak to that has been put out there, and now it's even more prevalent, that there has been an agreement at the federal level with the Liberals and the NDP is the Clean Jobs Training Center that is being promoted throughout that. We have a lot to talk about in that way. Our union supports skilled trades development and academic development so that people that are coming from and transferring out of high schools into their careers have opportunity to look at low carbon emission careers that are going to make us or take us to the goals that we're attempting to achieve. So in our opinion, a Clean Jobs Training Center is not going to just be a bricks and mortar building located somewhere in Canada that workers have to travel across the country to enter to and get that training to be a geothermal technician or a wind turbine electrician or a solar panel manufacturing technician. We have to work together with the universities and the colleges across the provinces and the territories to ensure that there are properly developed learning opportunities so that workers will not be left behind, that they will have an opportunity to grow their education and their skills, and we can make this program work effectively without leaving any workers behind. And I'll leave that and turn it back over to Carol.
Thanks so much, Ken, Émile, and Julia. So you have heard today some key criteria that we will be using to assess this emissions reduction plan. We've heard about some of the questions we'll be asking. So whether it responds to the requirements of the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, if it is accountable and transparent, whether it equitably targets all sectors of the Canadian economy and contains policies that end this continued expansion of the fossil industry and scale up the supply of clean energy in Canada, and whether it shows how Canada will promote a just transition that leaves no one behind, including workers and communities, which must be at the center of this transition. And so I wanted to add a few additional criteria that Climate Action Network Canada will be using in its analysis of the plan. So first, does the plan connect the benefits of climate action to people's everyday lives? Julia talked about these indicators that are more granular that we would like to see. For many folks, emissions reductions are a very abstract concept that they cannot see or touch. And climate impacts and climate action have a huge impact on the daily lives of Canadians. The improvement of air quality, for instance, has positive impacts on health. It has an increased impact on the quality of life. It can contribute to better jobs and better access to key infrastructure. So these co-benefits are too scarcely communicated, and the plan must fix this. We've been through 2 years with heartbreaking consequences of these overlapping crises that I was describing earlier. Canadians are tired and worried about the future. It is crucial for the plan to go beyond megatons and show how this plan will bring about the social and economic transformation that the climate crisis requires so urgently. The second question I wanted to mention is whether the plan will prioritize Indigenous rights and leadership. As extensively documented by Indigenous climate action, Canadian climate plans and policies have historically been anchored in a colonial approach that it excludes Indigenous rights holders from the decision-making table. We will be following the Assembly of First Nations lead and analysis of whether this plan whether its response to the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act statutory requirement to consider Indigenous knowledge follows equitable knowledge co-production mechanisms, whether the contents of the plan respect the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and so that means all the policies in there and their implementation, and finally, if there is assurance that the next emissions reduction plan process will be more inclusive of First Nations thinking and leadership. And finally, we will be looking out for whether the plan shows how Canada reaches its current, goes above, Canada's current insufficient target to reduce emissions by 40 to 45%. Of course, the plan is required by law to show how government intends to get there, but that target is far below what we need to do to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. Our analysis at Climate Action Network Canada shows that to do our fair share of the global effort fighting climate change, Canada needs to cut emissions by 60% below 2005 by 2030. So to conclude, this plan will be the first major test for Canada's new climate accountability framework. Minister Stephen Guilbeault has the chance to set a strong precedent for ambitious and rigorous planning and define climate policy for years to come during a crucial event where and when extreme weather events, as we've felt throughout the past months, are already wreaking havoc across the country. He must not miss this opportunity. Merci beaucoup. Au plaisir de répondre à vos questions.
Merci beaucoup, Caro. We'll now open up the floor for questions. Feel free to just raise your hand and call on you, and you can unmute yourself, or else you can just put your question in the chat and the panelists can respond. And also just responding to the question in the chat about the PowerPoint, we will be sending out a follow-up email to attendees with various links to recordings, and we'll include the link to the PowerPoint in there as well. And also contact information so that you can get in touch with all of these wonderful folks after the ERP is released to see how it measures up. If we don't have any immediate volunteers for questions, we do have some questions that were submitted by email from Natasha at the National Observer, who wasn't able to join us. So I might just read those out and then we can take live questions once folks put up their hands. So this is a bit of a three-parter. I'll just read it out and different panelists can respond to different elements of the question if you'd like. What aspects of the plan will make or break whether it is a credible plan to achieve the government's stated goal of a 40 to 45% emissions reduction below 2005 level by 2030? Second part of the question is, how important are deadlines? For example, I'm thinking about deadlines re fossil fuel subsidies or more incremental ones to help us achieve EV goals or things like that. Any particularly critical deadlines to note? And third, the most important policy measures the plan should include. Caro, do you maybe want to get us started with addressing some of those high-level questions?
For sure, I can start, and my instinct is to turn to Julia, who I think has the legal analysis to answer some of these more precisely. But so I would say, first off, that the critical threshold of whether this plan is credible is if it shows that all the measures in the plan add up to our objective. Canada has never been able to present a plan that shows that it has actually plans to reach its own objectives. If it does in this plan, as required by the Act, and as Julia has eloquently explained, it would be a first and very kind of basic, but at the same time, crucial step forward. The other thing I would say about deadlines is that in fact, deadlines are crucial for all the policies that we'll be seeing in the plan. Climate change, to use perhaps a cheesy metaphor, climate action by the government is a little bit like a group assignment at school. It requires the involvement of all government, a whole of government approach of different ministries, and the plan is a little bit like the government's work plan to deliver that. If it's not clear who is delivering which policy on what deadline, it makes it really hard to track how the group is advancing on delivering this crucial team effort. So we'll be looking out for deadlines for every single policy that the government has decided to adopt.
And just a couple of points in addition to Caro's, I would say that When you think about credibility, what it means in this context, I'll relate it back to accountability, because that's, this plan is being delivered under the Net Zero Emissions Act, which is essentially an act that responds to decades of research showing that the way to change track, if you've got a track history of failing to meet targets, take a strong look at how transparent and accountable you are. Improving on those fronts will improve your deliverables on policies and on actually achieving your targets. So is to be accountable, then you bring it back to those points that I made, and to distill them essentially, is it trackable? Is it complete? As Caro said, what we have so far is a bit of a patchwork. We have the Pan-Canadian framework. You have that initial framework plan delivered 2016. We had synthesis reports on it up to 2019, but none since. We had the Strengthened Climate Plan in 2020, which referenced somewhat the PCF, added measures, but didn't attempt to provide a comprehensive look. So the ERP really needs to be filling that hole. I had an interesting conversation a few weeks, maybe a month or so ago now, with a student from Carleton, a journalism student, who is trying desperately to figure out the Canadian climate policy. How are we going to meet our targets? And I said, well, you have to look here, here, over here a little bit too. That's not the answer we should be providing the Canadian government. This is where you look. And then again, when you look there, you need a full and detailed answer. We don't want PR. There should be some of that communication, that higher level, speak to people who aren't in the nuts and bolts, but you also need the nuts and bolts. The detail has to be there. This is a time for unvarnished truth so that Canadians can see what needs to be done next and prepare for the next steps to follow. And so really, I think those are the pieces about credibility. And I completely second the points that Caroline made about timelines and deadlines. They are specifically mentioned as a requirement in the Act itself. And again, they are just a best practice requirement if you're going to deliver on accountability, which the entire Act purports to do.
Thanks very much, Julia. Ken or Émile, is there anything that you'd like to add to that, or shall we move on to the next question?
Well, I just want to add that there was a mention in there about EVs, and most people are aware. So we've adopted an EV mandate of 2035 in Canada for vehicle sales. And I'm not quite sure how this happened, but it would seem as if the vehicle manufacturing sector is going to end up leading the way on how to reach these targets. What we've already seen in Canada alone, Unifor in its last set of bargaining, we bargained $6.5 billion of EV manufacturing into Canada. That's right now the first up that is being transferred into that new electric vehicle world is in Ingersoll, Ontario, where they are going to stop making an SUV and they will be building a fully electric, 2 separate fully electric cargo vehicles. And yesterday there was a major announcement of a new battery plant, which by the way was highly competed for across North America. That was allocated to Windsor, a partnership between LG and Stellantis, formerly Chrysler. So what is happening is that this is an example that investment for future can take place if we're given the time and the ability to do so. The thing that I would suggest that's not happening ahead of this 2035 mandate is not enough education, quite frankly, from the government itself of what the value is of purchasing an electric vehicle over an internal combustion vehicle. How exactly does that work? Where does the electricity come from? These are the questions that people are asking. But it's going to take some time, and they have the opportunity to do that. there are currently, at least 2019 statistics say that there were over 25 million internal combustion engines on the roads in Canada. It's going to take a while for those to transition away and the electric vehicle purchases to happen, which some people may not agree, but is probably a good thing for the simple fact that we just simply don't have the infrastructure in Canada right now to give commuters the comfort that they can travel. We call it range anxiety. That is happening quickly, where we've even seen a flip-flop in Ontario, where we had the Ontario government take power and literally were tearing out electric vehicle charging stations in public parking lots, and now making an announcement this week that they're going to be investing millions of dollars to put more in play. So if there's a case study to be seen on how are we going to reach the net zero issues and accomplishments we want to, I would suggest people keep an eye on what's happening in the vehicle manufacturing and selling sector of things, because it seems like that's where the charge is being led.
Thanks so much for that insight, Ken. I think in the interest of time, we might move on to the next question, if that's all right with you, Émile. So we've got David Thurton at CBC. David, go ahead.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for hosting this. I really appreciate this. I have a couple of questions. Just in trying to explain this what's happening next week to Canadians, like, is this a good analogy or metaphor to kind of explain this? Because like, we've had climate plans before, and now we have another one. So people probably will be so confused. Like, you know, then we have the Pan-Canadian framework and whatnot. Is it almost like a New Year's resolution? Like you've decided, okay, I'm going to lose this much weight, right? But you don't really say how you're going to lose the weight. You might go on this crash unhealthy diet. You might do this juice cleanse. You might try and do all like these old things that are really body negative and really stuff you shouldn't be doing. Instead of having like maybe a thorough thought out plan with a nutritionist, with a gym instructor, or you know, is that what we're talking about here? That this is more, it's like, this is the whole process. This is what we hope for, that, okay, we've set this great goal of losing all this emission belly weight, right? And, but what we're looking for is like the real concrete workout plan or fitness plan. Is that, I just want to run that by the experts here.
Who wants to take a crack at that? Julia?
Yeah, it's a great analogy. It's I mean, it's going to be an intense workout plan. Like, I want to see day by day, you know, like what days you're going to the gym, what vehicle you're taking to get there, obviously the bus, because that's how granular we need it to be, you know, and but it's a good analogy of kind of taking it to the next level of detail. I mean, we use the household budget as another example. Sure, we're going to stay within our yearly budget of whatever, $50,000. But I'll just start spending money at the beginning of the year and see how I go. That's not going to work. You need a plan. You need to break it all out. What are my expenses? What do I need to achieve? And without that, you're just obviously not going to stay within your budget. And it's another way we talk about emissions, but really we need to stay within a set of emissions in order to reach our targets. We need to contract them, bring them down. And we can't keep blowing past the sort of yearly amounts that we have been, because then that blows the targets out of the water and we won't meet 2030. We won't stay within. Of course, the driving force of all of this is a safe climate. So great analogy. Yeah.
I think yours was better. I might steal that if that's okay. And all of this is on the record, right? Like we can use this in like stories and stuff like that over the next couple of days. That's okay. Okay.
Yeah.
The other question I just wanted to ask is, do you think we might, it sounds like a lot of people have been calling for carbon budgets as to be a part of the Net Zero Accountability Act. Do you think that they could slip that into a plan, or are you hoping that could be slipped into the plan, maybe in like the sectoral targets section?
Thanks, David. Do we have any volunteers to tackle that question?
Carol, do you want to go first, or I can?
I can maybe kind of talk about the indeed, most groups on this briefing were advocating for carbon budget as the main or one of the key pillars of the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. Unfortunately, that wasn't the approach chosen by then Minister Wilkinson when he was at ECCC. I think Climate Action Network Canada continues to believe that this carbon budgeting approach is one that has a proven track record and is pretty much the gold standard as we've seen it deliver results in the UK, notably. I'm not sure how they could kind of insert that in the plan, and I would be surprised if they did. But Julia, I'm curious to hear if, yeah.
I mean, a budget is another way of thinking about a target, one which is a little bit more precise. So a target is your endpoint. And if you draw your line and from A to B and take up everything below that line, that's your total emissions. And we say you should be specifying that as well as your endpoint, because the line that you take from A to B matters. The quicker you decrease your emissions and the fewer your emissions are between 2022 and 2030, the fewer total emissions are out there in the world. And it's about total, because of the long half-life of CO2, it's about total emissions in the atmosphere. That really, really matters. But you can get at it a little bit in other ways by doing things like having a 2026 objective, if that's ambitious and that kind of draws out, gives us a sense of the pathway that they intend to take to 2030, then again, that gives us some of the certainty that a carbon budget will give you. If you have more information on a sectoral basis, as you say, speaking to the pathways for those sectors, again, you can translate that to total emissions. Again, it's about more certainty, and that in turn delivers more accountability, because then when you start to see exceedances, then you say, oh, we have to do something better. It's harder to track an exceedance if you're talking about something 8 years down the road. If you're able to give yourself more hallmarks, more hooks between now and then, and budgets are another way of hooking in, giving yourself more information between now and then you can deliver more accountability. More transparency means you're more likely to meet your target down the road.
I have one more question, but I will let someone else ask questions. I can come back to it.
Yeah, if that's all right, we'll just move on because I see a couple other folks, or Patrick has raised his hand, and then we can come back to you at the end, David. Patrick, vas-y.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm sorry, I don't even know where my, oh, the camera's on. Okay, here we go. This is the question I'm having. Survey shows that about 71% of Canadians say that they think that we're not doing enough to fight climate change. But in the last 5 years, the most sold vehicle in Canada was an SUV. So are Canadians asking basically the government to do everything for them?
Any takers for that? Yeah, Cathal, go ahead.
I think climate action is often talked about in a way that involves kind of personal and individual choices and sacrifices, whereas we know that to decarbonize our economy completely by as soon as possible before 2050, it's going to require a whole transformation of our economy. So I think, you know, I always like to ask the three whys. Why are Canadians buying so much SUVs? And I think that Équiterre is doing a lot of work on that. I'll let Émile complete, but it's not because suddenly we need bigger and bigger vehicles. There have been these trends are driven by the supply of cars. They're market driven, and the role of government in that case is to regulate, to make sure that emissions from the transport sector right there are not ballooning, as we're seeing by this continued increase in vehicle size. So I know Émile and Équiterre are doing some concrete work on that. I'll let him complete.
Oui, mais merci Caro, Patrick, ça va si on se parle en français.
Avec plaisir.
Donc, effectivement, ce n'est pas juste un choix qui est individuel, ça vient des structures qui sont présentes. Et c'est vrai qu'on a vu une hausse très, très sérieuse du nombre de VUS sur nos routes. Il y a des multiples facteurs qui nous ont menés à cet endroit-là, mais il y a de multiples façons aussi de sortir de cette tendance-là. Il y en a une, c'est de réglementer la publicité, par exemple. On voit qu'il y a environ 80% des ventes qui sont des VUS, mais c'est aussi parce qu'il y a le même niveau de publicité qui mettent en valeur des VUS aussi. Donc, il y a un moyen de réglementer la publicité. Il y a un moyen aussi d'avoir un système de redevance remise, par exemple, sur les véhicules où, en ce moment, on a la carotte. Donc, pour les personnes qui veulent acheter un véhicule électrique, il y a des rabais qui sont disponibles à l'achat des véhicules, mais on n'a pas de bâton. Et puis, un système de bonus-malus ou de redevance remise viendrait faire en sorte qu'il y aurait une pénalité pour les véhicules qui ont un impact environnemental qui est plus grand. C'est cette pénalité-là qui permettrait de financer la remise pour les personnes qui achètent des véhicules électriques ou qui achètent des vélos électriques même, par exemple, qui nous permettrait de réduire le nombre total de véhicules et non pas juste échanger un véhicule à combustion interne pour un véhicule électrique. Le but, au final, c'est d'avoir le moins de véhicules sur nos routes. Donc, ça passe par une norme sur les véhicules zéro émission aussi qui est plus stricte, qui oblige les constructeurs automobiles et les détaillants automobiles à avoir des véhicules en inventaire. En ce moment, on sait que si, en tant que citoyen, on veut aller s'acheter un véhicule électrique, ça se peut qu'on fasse la ligne pendant des mois de temps avant d'en recevoir un. Et donc, ça peut certainement décourager les choix individuels. Donc, c'est au gouvernement de venir mettre en place toutes sortes de mécanismes qui vont permettre de réguler l'offre qui est disponible pour les acheteurs.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Patrick, est-ce que vous avez des autres questions ou des questions de suivi?
Non, moi ça va, merci.
Parfait. Is there anyone else who hasn't had a chance to ask any questions yet who would like to come in? Okay, then recognizing that we're just about at 3 o'clock and that some people may have to leave at this point, I'd just like to say, in case you do have to hop off, thank you so much for attending this briefing. We really appreciate your taking the time to talk with us. And as mentioned, I will send out an email as quickly as possible after this with the recording, contact information for all the participants, and the link to Julia's presentation. I also just wanted to mention, while we have you here, that if anyone is interested in covering other stories around the just transition, CAN-Rac and Environmental Defense will be hosting a summit next week on the just transition, bringing together different labor groups and people from all around the country to have some of these challenging discussions. And while most of these sessions won't be open to media, there will be some exciting people in town who would be very happy to do media interviews on background or just to have a conversation or on the record. And I can definitely help set those up. So we have folks from the Canadian Labour Congress, from Indigenous Climate Action, Blue Green Canada, Unifor, of course, and the Fédération des Travailleurs et Travailleuses du Québec. So don't hesitate to reach out, and I may be sending some of you some pitches related to that. And now I'll let you ask your other questions, David.
Yeah, no, it's just one question. It's more news of the day. The natural resources minister, sorry, it's natural resources. Yeah, Jonathan Wilkinson is natural resources. He said today that in Canada's industry is willing to increase production incrementally by 300,000 barrels per day. I'm just wondering, what do people think about this? You know, a couple of days before this plan is supposed to be released to send the right signal.
Caro, do you want to speak first to that? And then maybe Émile, you can come in as well.
Sure, and David will be, actually we have something that's coming out later today related to this and related to the fossil industry's instrumentalization of this crisis to ask for more fossil infrastructure and push for increased fossil production. Definitely this crisis has shown how energy security requires an energy transition and how the two are intrinsically linked at a time of these overlapping crises that I was describing earlier. And so I really wonder if increasing our economy's dependency on the revenues from a very volatile commodity at this point is the best approach, given how we've seen Europe, for instance, rather accelerate its targets to move to clean power and accelerate efficiency measures. I'm wondering if Canada focusing on clean energy and efficiency cooperation would have perhaps been safer from an energy security perspective, but from a climate perspective as well.
Oui, ben, Caroline, je pense que tu as bien couvert la question. Peut-être juste ajouter à ça qu'une crise ne doit pas en effacer une autre. On est en ce moment dans une crise climatique qui est mondiale, qui est là pour rester aussi. Et il ne faudrait pas la mettre de côté au premier soubresaut. On doit avoir un objectif qui est clair, la carboneutralité le plus rapidement possible d'ici 2050. Et on ne peut pas changer de direction à chaque soubresaut qu'on va avoir sur notre chemin. Et donc, comme Caroline l'a très bien dit, il faut voir cette crise humanitaire-là, cette guerre, comme un moyen d'accélérer la transition énergétique, de sortir des énergies fossiles qui nous ont menés partiellement à ce conflit. Et donc, c'est bien dommage de voir que le Canada ne s'enligne pas nécessairement dans la bonne direction. Et il ne faudrait pas du tout que l'annonce d'aujourd'hui laisse présager d'autres annonces de ce genre par la suite. Il faut miser sur la sobriété énergétique, sur l'efficacité énergétique, sur les énergies renouvelables. Le Canada a le potentiel, autant domestiquement qu'à l'international, d'être un leader en la matière. Et donc, il faut aller dans cette direction-là plutôt que de continuer à s'enfoncer dans le trou des énergies fossiles.
Merci beaucoup, Émile. Any follow-ups to that, David?
No, that's all. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Wonderful. I'll just open the floor then if any of our speakers, assuming that we don't have any final questions from anyone else, which I'm not seeing. Julia, Émile, Caro, and Ken, any final quick thoughts that you want to share? Okay. Possibly an hour was enough to have everything that you wanted to say. So just once again, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate your attention to this. And you'll certainly be hearing from all of us next week when the plan does come out. Thanks again and bonne journée.